Let's go to the debate side. Claire McCaskill, just your view about the lead up this debate and what we might see tonight.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch the Republicans try to back the truck up about expectations of Joe Biden's performance. Listen, all Joe Biden has to do is come out there and be Scrappy Joe Scranton, as my friend Jim Palmieri likes to call him, and throw some haymakers. He needs to tell him to shut up. He needs to tell him to quit lying. He needs to be a street fighter tonight. He doesn't need to be as presidential as he's inclined to try to be. In policy is great, but it's more important that he get under Donald Trump's skin. And the way you get under Donald Trump's skin is you confront him with his BS. And I'm hoping that Joe Biden does that. And I have a feeling that's what they've been preparing for at Camp David.
So, Tim, talk to us about what punches Biden should throw, those haymakers. What particular vulnerability should he try to strike? And just give us a 30,000-foot sense as to the stakes of tonight. This has been billed as the most important debate in generations. Do you agree?
I think it's really important for Joe Biden. And a big part of this is, if you just look at the numbers, we're trying to figure out Democratic Senate candidates are running ahead of Joe Biden. Like, why is that? What is underneath that? And I think a part of it is there's a certain type of voter that hasn't tuned in as much, that is part of the Democratic coalition, that's a little worried about his age. Maybe they're unhappy about inflation. And if Joe Biden shows that he's the vigorous Joe Biden that he showed at the State of the Union, if he reminds those voters why they hate Donald Trump, because most of the voters don't like Donald Trump at all, then I think that he is poised to gain a couple of points in the polls and win some of those folks back. So I think you got to go after Trump on his extremism, obviously on social issues, on issues like abortion. But you also have to trigger Donald Trump a little bit. You know, my colleague at the board, Mark Caputo, said that Trump, Trump might seem irrational, and he's mostly irrational, but he's got a lizard brain, and he knows that he botched the first debate last time. And so he's going to try to soften his edges a little bit. And I think that Joe Biden's got to, make sure that he gets under his skin a little bit and get the crazy Donald Trump that we all know and love, out on the debate stage tonight.
Doris, tonight's debate is going to be a fascinating trip back to the future. You have to go back to 1960. Of course, a presidential debate very much, you know about, and you've written about eloquently, the Kennedy-Nixon debate, where there's no studio audience. And it was so fascinating hearing the stories after, time began. People listening on the radio thought Nixon won. People watching on television thought Kennedy won. But again, without an audience cheering, it was really left to the viewer to draw their conclusions. And we're going to have the same thing tonight.
Absolutely right. What's interesting is the debate did not have to become a tradition after 1960. In fact, Eisenhower had warned Nixon not to do it. Don't give Kennedy the advantage of standing side by side with you. And then in 1964, it was told to LBJ. In fact, my husband wrote a memo to him and said, "Don't debate. You're the president of the United States. Don't give your opponent the stature to stand next to you." Then, of course, in 68 and 72, Nixon was not to make the same mistake twice, right? So it took 1976 for Ford, who was behind in the polls, to decide that he wanted to debate Carter because he needed the debate, he thought, which of course ended up being a mistake, since on the second debate he was asked a question about the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. And he said, no, there's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there'll never be one in a Ford administration. Max Frankel tried to give him a second chance to get it right, and he still did it wrong. And the problem was it reinforced that feeling that he was ill-informed or not very smart. But then after that, the debates continued. As you know, they got audiences. They got people interrupting one another. They lost that sort of centrality of two people talking straight to the camera as they did in 1960. And tonight we're going to have that more. We've gone back to that so that we can focus on it. What everybody's saying about expectations, all that matters is we've got two guys tonight. They'll be live next to each other. And that's what people are going to want to see. And the people themselves are going to make up their mind as to whether or not they talked to them, whether or not they said the truth, whether or not they were believable, whether or not they cared about their problems. I can't wait. The whole country, I'm sure, is both anxious and excited about what's going to happen tonight.
Yeah, Mike, Doris is right. This is a real tune-in moment for a country that has tuned out this campaign. A lot of people have, outside of our world of political junkies. People are just sort of sick of seeing these two guys and say, call me after Labor Day. But tonight will be interesting for many of the reasons that Doris laid out, including the fact that there is no It's not a rally. You're not going to hear big applause and hooting and hollering when Donald Trump says something. It's just going to sit there. If he says he won the 2020 election, the moderators have time to jump in and follow up. The format will be fascinating to watch.
It is. It's going to be fascinating to watch for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't think any of us really appreciate the tumult that has really rocked this nation for several years. Parts of this country has never really gotten over COVID and the shutdowns after COVID. I mean, they're still living with the consequences of that, especially if you have school children who miss 2 years of school, things like that. So tonight, I think President Biden's principal job, and Claire alluded to it, is to remind an unfocused nation on who the opponent is, to remind a nation of who Donald Trump is and what Donald Trump did and did not do during his presidency. It's going to be interesting to see how he does it. I think he's going to be fairly tough on Trump to try and get him react. And again, to Claire's point, to get him to overreact, perhaps. And shutting off the microphones won't make any difference if Trump really overreacts. You'll hear him. And I think that's what they're banking on. Jonathan, you've been there. You're there today, obviously. What's your sense of the internals in the Biden campaign prep in terms of reminding the country of who Donald Trump was as president?
Yeah, that's key to what they want to do. They want to draw a contrast between Biden and Trump, and they also want to lift the sense of Trump amnesia that has settled across a lot of the country here, who just have this gauzy remembrances, oh, the economy was good or something, and instead forget a lot of the day-to-day dramas here and the tumult. So I've been told that Biden will indeed push the idea of the convicted felon. That's a phrase we'll likely hear tonight from him. He's going to, of course, talk about abortion rights. He's going to talk about January 6th. He's going to talk about the 2020 election and try to get Donald Trump to repeat the big lie in front of a national television audience. So Claire, those we've outlined here in the last few minutes the way that Biden is going to go on the attack, but let's talk a little bit about how he's going to have to play some defense too. Donald Trump's team is previewed. Yes, we're going to hear about Hunter Biden, but more than that, it's going to be about immigration and inflation. How should the president respond?
Well, I think Biden has a pretty good story to tell about the immigration issue. All Biden has to do is focus the audience on the fact that he was for the toughest immigration bill in decades, and Donald Trump stopped it. And so he had to take action. And since he took action, the border crossings are down by 40% already. So you see, first, Donald Trump blocking because he didn't want a political win for his opponent, once again being selfish, putting himself before country, and then Joe Biden taking decisive action and getting good results. As long as he keeps it in that contrast, he's going to be fine on immigration. The key here is, and I think you see it in some of the pre-debate stuff from the Biden campaign, they want to remind people that Donald Trump is all about himself and Joe Biden is about you. And I think you'll hear that theme over and over again, running through all the contrasts that Biden will try to draw.
Yeah, Biden and his surrogates really coalescing all around that idea as one of their central themes between now and November. So, Tim, tell us a little bit more about what else you're looking out for tonight. I think we should expect the president to make a robust defense of democracy at home and abroad. And the foreign policy doesn't usually sway too many voters' minds. You know, Ukraine and the Russian invasion might.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be too hard for starters to get Donald Trump to repeat the big lie. So I think that's a good low bar for the Biden campaign to start with. I think he'll be able to do that pretty easily. And on the foreign policy, yeah, I talked earlier about how, Biden does have to speak to his base, the soft parts of his base. But then the Nikki Haley voter, right, the Ukraine and commitment to democracy at home and abroad, that is going to be the issue for the Bulwark folks, my folks. Can you get to those suburban, college-educated Republicans who don't know what's happening at the Wall Street Journal? I think it's getting a little crazy over there. With their attacks on Joe Biden, and can he contrast with Trump on that and put Trump in this box where Trump is defending Putin, Trump is attacking our allies at NATO, and he's attacking our institutions at home? Yeah, I think that's a good run of issues for Biden. He's got to be careful on foreign policy because the other side of that coin is Trump is going to say, the world's on fire, everything's crazy, everything was calm when I was here. And I think that one of the challenges President Biden is going to have is not being too defensive on those questions, staying on the attack, having crisp answers about what he's been doing, but also attacking Donald Trump, on the ways that he's going to alienate us in the world.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.